And so it's with great joy that I speak to you today from the words of the gospel that has shaped our family and shaped your church. The theme I chose for today is serving God's purpose in your own generation. This is a phrase taken from Acts 13, where Paul is giving a sermon in a synagogue in Antioch. And he has this argument about, he's arguing with these people that Jesus rose from the dead. And in one of his arguments, one of his sentences, he says, "Now when David had served God's purpose in his own generation, he fell asleep. He was buried with his ancestors, and his body decayed. But the one whom God raised from the dead did not decay." And what struck me from this sentence was that phrase, when David had served God's purpose in his own generation. And today I'm going to speak about how each generation has a responsibility to serve God's purpose in its own generation. There are 4 generations of our family represented here. Sarah's mother, Jean, Sarah and I, another generation, Heidi and Oju, another generation, and Nadia and Yakim, the 4th generation. And each of our generations has a responsibility to serve God's purpose in our own generation. And Ralph Larson served God's purpose in his generation. When he went to Ethiopia as a young man and gave his life as part of God's purpose, gave his life for the people of Ethiopia, for the people of Ambo. And in so doing, he served God's purpose. Sarah and I, in the 1970s, the late 1970s, felt a call from God to move to Plow Creek Fellowship, which is a small intentional Christian community in Illinois. And I had just, like Ralph Larson, in his generation, had felt this call to being a missionary. I had felt this call to this particular church, and Sarah had also. And so we moved there. And we moved there on Memorial Day, 1977. And it was a few months before we joined the church there. And we met with one of the elders of the church. And after a few months, he said, "Okay, I think you're ready to join." And when we said, "Okay, yeah, we think we're ready to join," and he said, "Okay, we'll set the date of your joining," and he said, "We'll set it for November 13th, 1977. And after that meeting, Sarah said to me, "Do you realize that that's the date that my father was killed in Ethiopia?" And I didn't know that. I didn't recall that at the time, but I just had this deep sense of the Lord saying through that, of course, the elder who set the date, he had no idea that was a significant date in our family history either. And I realized that God was, really giving us a clear message that, he was going to do amazing things through our following him in our generation and committing our lives to serving him at Plow Creek Fellowship. And as you can see, when Sarah shared, the Lord truly did do amazing things in her life as we served in our generation. I want to use the Beatitudes to help us think about how to serve God's purpose in our own generation. And I want to start with the last Beatitude because, well, you'll see why. Got it. Okay. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. When I was a young man, this was not my favorite beatitude. Blessed are you when people insult you. I would prefer not to be insulted. But God knows, Jesus knew that those things would happen. He also knew that some of his servants would not only be insulted, but be killed. And like Ralph Larson was. And the reason I chose this last beatitude to read first is because I think that Jesus put the Beatitudes in the order that he did because he knew that we needed to take a long journey before we could get to that last one where we would be able to know that we're blessed when we're insulted and when we're treated like the prophets were before. The next beatitude is the one at the beginning of of this section. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. When Sarah and I were married in May 18, 1974, we have this beautiful wedding album, and we both look great. You know, we were just so happy to be married to each other. But beneath that wonderful glowing pictures was the fact that both of us were very poor in spirit. Sarah was poor in spirit, as she's mentioned, because she was orphaned before she was even born. I was poor in spirit because I had become disabled with rheumatoid arthritis when I was a teenager, when I was 16. And when I was 12, I thought the Lord was calling me to be a pastor. And then I became disabled with rheumatoid arthritis, and I prayed for healing. My church prayed for healing. And we did it over and over and over again, and the Lord didn't heal me. And so I had this deep sadness within me of not understanding why, you know, I was physically disabled, and it didn't seem like I could be a pastor. So I was questioning, you know, did I really hear the Lord when I was 12 years old? Since, you know, physically it doesn't seem like I can be a pastor. And so I had a very poor spirit at that point in time. Well, the next beatitude is, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. And again, you know, when you're young, you don't understand these things. How can you be blessed and when you mourn? But as Sarah so vividly shared, it was a blessing for her to mourn the loss of her father, because, you know, she mourned and mourned for a long time, but when her mourning was complete, she understood the love of the Father in a way that she never did when she was holding all of this grief in of having been born an orphan. And I too had to walk that journey of grief, of grieving the fact that, you know, I just could not do all the things that I had planned on doing, you know, that that I enjoy doing. I played guitar. I couldn't no longer play guitar. I loved playing basketball. I could no longer play basketball. I thought God had called me to be a pastor, and it seemed like I just physically couldn't do it, And so I had much to mourn. And and I grew up in Minnesota, and I'm Norwegian, and we Norwegians, we know how to suffer in silence, and so I was just trying to tough it out. All these horrible things that happened to me, I just tried to tough it out, and I didn't mourn it. I just tried to keep going, Well, eventually that stopped working. I was so miserable, I started just getting really depressed because I just couldn't ignore all of this grief that I was having. And so finally, after I'd been at Plow Creek for a few years, 3 or 4 years, we had a small group, and I decided to tell this small group the story of what it was like for me to become disabled. And I told that story, and I wept as I told it, and people there cried with me, especially one older sister who has such a good heart. She cried with me, and it was during that time that I was able to write in my journal what I really wanted to know from the Lord. I said, Lord, I want to know that you loved me right at the point I became disabled, and right at the point that you did not heal me. And after I had done this sharing, one of the older sisters in that small group said, Richard, I think maybe we ought to do resting in the Spirit prayer with you. And that was basically a way of saying, let's have a couple of us meet with you and just pray and ask the Lord to minister to you and however he wants to minister to you. And at first, I didn't want to do that because it reminded me too much of having been laid hands on for many times when I was first disabled. The church would lay hands on me and pray for healing, and I would never be healed. And so it felt like going back and doing that again. Well, one of the next beatitude is, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. That's meek people do what the Lord tells them to do. That's basically the simple fact of what it means to be meek. Meek people do what the Lord tells them to do. And so I felt like the Lord was telling me that I should do this prayer session with a couple of people and just really ask him to minister to me about all of my grief for having become disabled. And so in an amazing coincidence, about the same time, the church at Plow Creek decided to call me to become one of their pastoral elders. And so here it was. I thought, that when I became disabled, that I could no longer be a pastor. And then after being a part of this church for 3 or 4 years, they said, no, I think you can be a pastor. And they called me, and God called me to be a pastor of that church. And in another one of those amazing divine coincidences, the Sunday morning that they laid hands on me as a congregation to pray for me as I became one of their pastoral elders, that afternoon I met with this couple a couple of people to do this prayer session. And so we started this prayer session, and they basically opened in prayer and then just waited to see what the Spirit wanted to do. And at first, all I could think of was to say to the Lord, Lord, I am not to blame. I am not to blame for becoming disabled. And then there was another period of silence. And then this woman who was part of the prayer session said to me, Richard, I sense the Lord saying, Richard, do you love me? And when I heard that, I started to cry because I wasn't sure I could say, Jesus, I love you. And then she got the Bible out and she read that whole passage where Jesus asked Peter 3 times, Peter, do you love me? And it's after the resurrection. And again, I just felt like, I couldn't say it, and yet I wanted to. So I forced myself to say, Jesus, I love you. And then I forced myself to say it again, Jesus, I love you. And then all of a sudden, deep within me, these words formed that I knew were utterly true. I said, Jesus, I love you more than life and health. And that those words were just, came from so deep within me that I knew that they were absolutely true. And shortly after that, the prayer session ended, and I was sort of totally confused about what had happened because I knew it was a very emotional experience for me, but I just didn't know, exactly what the Lord was doing, through this. And so I said that, and this woman said, well, I think probably the Lord will make it clear in a few days. And a few days later, I remembered what I had written in my journal about saying, Jesus, I want to know that you loved me right at the point I became disabled and right at the point you did not heal me. And I realized that in asking me, Richard, do you love me? And then helping me to answer it in those words that came from my utter depth. Jesus, you know I love you more than life and health. That God and I had connected at an extremely profound level. And from then on, I was just free, I still have a broken body, but I do not have that broken spirit that I had. And so that allowed me to go on and to freely serve the Lord without any, wonderings about, why didn't you heal me, or questioning him in any way. And it gave me a real freedom that I have to this day, to serve the Lord, to speak the truth to people, to delight in the gospel, and to know that it's utterly true, no matter what the circumstances are in your life. The next beatitude is, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. I love this verse because all of us need mercy. All of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And Jesus came, the way Paul says it is that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And that is the absolute definition of mercy. That while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And so if you haven't committed your life to the Lord, I invite you to do it right now. Because, he just loves to show mercy to people. He showed mercy to Sarah when she was so grief-stricken over the loss of her father. He showed mercy to me when I was angry at him for not healing me, you know. And he shows mercy over and over again when he takes people who are sinners into his company of believers. And so, I just really invite you today to join in this wonderful group of people who have been shown God's mercy. The next beatitude is, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. The only way to have a pure heart is to spend time with God. There's a saying in the technology world: garbage in, garbage out. In other words, if you screw up when you're programming a computer, it's going to come out screwed up. Well, it's the same way in our hearts. We need to be taking in pure things into our hearts in order to be able to have a pure heart. And sometimes when I think about a pure heart, I think it's like water. It's like a wonderful glass of pure water. And that's so good to drink. If it's polluted water, we all know that it's a disaster to drink. Well, when we have a pure heart, people like being around us because we're refreshing to them. If we don't have a pure heart, it's not only not good for us, it's not good for the people around us. And so Jesus said, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. There's just something, when we spend time with God, we see him, and that's just such a wonderful gift, and it shapes our lives tremendously when we have a pure heart and we see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. This is another one of those hard words that Jesus likes to speak, because the only way you can have peacemakers is if they're next to war makers. You're not a peacemaker when everything is going well. You're a peacemaker when things are going disastrous, and when people are being mean to you, or mean to people you love. That's when you can be a peacemaker. And that's just Jesus was a peacemaker. He had a very difficult life. Not only was his teachings challenged over and over again, but eventually he lost his life. He was living in a land that was occupied. They had foreign soldiers there, Romans, in their land, and yet he, as a peacemaker, he related to everyone. He healed the centurion's son, the Roman occupier, the son of a Roman occupier. That's what peacemakers do. They do good things to people who make life miserable for you. That's what a peacemaker is. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I several years ago, in addition to being a pastor, I've also always worked at other jobs where and so for a number of years, I was the director of development for a nonprofit and helped them raise funds. It was a nonprofit that served people with developmental disabilities. And at one point, the director of the organization asked me to lead a campaign to raise $1.2 million. And I had never raised that much money in my life, and the organization had never raised that much money, but we had a situation where there were a lot of people with developmental disabilities who were living in a nursing home, and their lives would be so much better if they could live in small group homes. instead of being crowded in a place with 80 people. And so the only way to do this was to do this campaign. And when we started it, of course, we had to spend some money to set up an office and prepare the materials for the campaign volunteers. And the head of the accounting department was sure that this campaign was not going to work. We were not going to raise the money. And so she started persecuting me. She didn't call it persecuting me, but she basically started spreading rumors through the organization saying I was spending money foolishly. And she did this repeatedly, trying to turn other people in the organization against this work. And that was very hurtful to me. And eventually one morning the Lord said, you have taken hits from a number of people here in this campaign, and I want you to forgive those people. And the way I want you to do that is, while you were on the way to work this morning, I want you to stop and find 5 stones and drop them into a creek with running water. And it was wintertime, so I had to drive the back roads to find a creek that had running water and the stones. And I found those, a creek with running water. I picked up 5 stones, and then as I dropped each one in, I forgave that person who had been giving me a hard time while I was leading this campaign. And the thing that just utterly amazed me is when I dropped in the first rock, the rock sank to the bottom and the water flowed on. And I just knew the Lord was saying, okay, you can drop the rocks, you can forgive these people, and you can flow on in your life. And so I did that. I flowed on in leading this campaign, and I no longer was harboring resentments against the folks who had been giving me a hard time. And a couple of years later, the campaign was at a place where it was obvious that we were probably going to meet that goal of raising $1.2 million. And this woman who had given me such a hard time gave to the campaign. She not only gave to the campaign, but she went out to her Harley owners motorcycle group and persuaded them to give money to the campaign. and the Lord said to me, Richard, if you had not forgiven her, she would not have been able to change her attitude towards the campaign. And so when I see that verse, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs are the kingdom of heaven. When we forgive those who persecute us, and when we treat them well, we never know what the Lord can do. The Lord can redeem in ways, just beyond our beliefs. And so I want to wrap up this morning. I want to go back to the beginning. The Beatitudes are a real good roadmap for how to serve your own generation, to fulfill God's purposes in your own generation. It's not going to be an easy road. Jesus was very honest in saying that. It's not going to be an easy road. But one of the things that I love about the Sermon on the Mount is that he ends it by saying, whoever hears these words and practices them is like the man who builds his house on the rock. And he contrasts that to the man who hears these words and does not practice them is like the man who builds his house on the sand. And of course, the storms come along and knock down the house on the sand, but the house on the rock stands. And so each generation, as it fulfills God's purposes, as it hears these words and practices them, it's like building a house on the rock. And, I'm just so grateful to be here today because, Sarah and I have, we were called to this particular church in Illinois, and that's where the Lord called us to serve, to fulfill his purposes for our generation. And now Heidi and Oju are here, and they're also sensing that perhaps the Lord is calling them to back to Ethiopia to serve out God's purposes there. And that the people would often ask me when our children were growing up at Plow Creek, well, are you encouraging your children to stay at Plow Creek? And I said no, because God has his own purposes for each generation, and each generation is responsible to hear their own call from the Lord and to serve the Lord for their generation. And Sarah and I are very much enjoying this stage of life, the grandparent stage of life. Oh, Sarah is holding Nadia right now. And, as grandparents, we're filling Nadia and Yakim with all the love we can, because we know that at one point in time, they too will be fulfilling God's purposes for their generation. It's the responsibility of each generation not only to serve God's purposes in their generation, but also to tell the wonders of God to the next generation. And it's those wonders of God passed on from generation to generation that makes it possible for each generation to serve God's purposes. Thank you very much for inviting us to be here today, and thank you for honoring us. Blessings.